Hey everybody, welcome back to Submarine History with your host, Haiku. Today we're talking with Captain James Ransom, United States Navy retired, about his article, Bleak December, in the December 2021 issue of Naval History Magazine, published by the United States Naval Institute. Captain Ransom's article discusses how U.S. submarines were supposed to be the key element in the Asiatic Fleet's defense of the Philippines in 1941, but the advancing Japanese tide rolled right over them in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. Captain Ransom, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, Steve. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm very excited that you accepted the opportunity to do this interview because it is still a small channel, but we are growing. And I think this is going to be a really good interview. So let's just get into it. Let's start off with the first question. Tell us a little bit about yourself personally and about your naval career.
Okay. Well, I'm a retired Navy captain. I spent 30 years in the submarine force, retiring about 10 years ago. Had command of a submarine fast tack boat, USS Miami. Spent a lot of time in both the Pacific, including the Westpac. Early in my career, I was the operations officer at a submarine group out in Yokosuka, Japan, that is really the kind of the direct descendant of the Asiatic Fleet submarine force. And so I was the ops officer routing submarines all around in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So I kind of had an affinity for the guys that were doing that from the shore side back in World War II. But I'm a history guy, majored in history at the Naval Academy, always been very fascinated by submarine history, including finishing up my career doing two things that kept me in touch with that. One, I was the chief of staff out at Commander Submarine Force U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, which is really the kind of the seat of World War II submarine history for the United States. And then I went on to teach strategy and policy at the Naval War College before I retired. And in fact, I still do that as an adjunct professor. So I worked for about 7 years after retiring and wasn't loving it. It was okay, but wasn't fascinating. So I decided, my wife and I decided, let's move to Florida. We're near a daughter and grandkids, which is fantastic, but it also gives me some time to be able to work on a project that I'm doing for hopefully someday for publication. But that's where that article from Naval History Magazine came from.
Okay.
So that's the short and dirty on me.
So what made you decide to go into the Navy? Was it something growing up you always knew you wanted to do it, or did you just fall into it?
I kind of always had that in the background. My father was a naval officer. He was a submariner. His father was a Naval Academy graduate who served on destroyers in the 1920s and 30s. So it was in the blood, but I wasn't, of course, when you're a young kid, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. But one day I went up to my dad and said, hey, I think I'd like to go to the Naval Academy. And he said, okay, you got to answer one question. And I said, what's that? And he said, do you want to be rich? Which was kind of, it's a tough question to ask a 17-year-old. And I thought about it and I said, well, no, not really. He said, that's fine, because if you go in the Navy, you're not ever going to be rich. He said, you're probably not going to be poor either. But, if you want the new car every 4 years and the best stereo, of course, that was back in the days when we all had to have cool stereo. Maybe you shouldn't go in the Navy. But I was fine with it. So that's how I got in. Didn't necessarily want to be a submariner. That's a different story. But that's where I ended up, and turned out real well.
Yeah, that's interesting because I have an older son he's in his last year of college right now, and we did an Annapolis application for him when he was looking at colleges, and that the process of putting together an application for a service academy, it's such a difficult, time-consuming, kind of weird, cryptic process that if you don't have the wherewithal just to get through the paperwork, you probably don't have the wherewithal to actually be in the Navy and put up with what you're going to be doing during during the time that you're in, you know?
Yeah, I'm sure it hasn't gotten any easier.
No, not at all. But what inspired you to write the article that you did? Is this your first time writing, or is this something that you've been doing?
Um, well, no, I mean, I haven't published anything, and up until this article, this is actually the first article that I've had published, and actually had, get a little monetary remuneration, which was nice. But it actually came from my project that I've been working on really in earnest since 2017. And I kind of always had the thought that as I was working on the book, and mostly to this point, it's really research. I have a lot written, but it's snippets and parts of chapters and thematically based. Um, but I always thought, some of this stuff might be kind of interesting for a uh, uh, publication in some, periodical. So I finally, I guess it was 2019, I presented a paper at the McMullen Naval History Symposium in Annapolis, and it was essentially, it was a format of this article that eventually got published in Naval History. And I submitted it to Naval History Magazine. And of course, that was 2019, 2020 COVID landing. And I think it all slipped through the cracks. So after about a year, I guess it was over a year, I kind of sent one more email to them, and I said, I kind of figured you guys had your act together and would at least tell me thanks but no thanks instead of not knowing anything. And they came back and said, "Whoops, we are sorry. we'll give it another look. It did fall through the cracks. We apologize." And then they kind of let me know that they were going to put it in the December issue, which makes sense because it's kind of all about December 1941. So it's the perfect time to go back and look at that 80 years later.
Right. Now, you and I, before we started this recording, and this is for the benefit of the people who are watching right now, but before we actually started this recording, you and I, we talked a little bit about your career. You have a very solid background. And I'm wondering, when you wrote the article and you saw that it was going to get published, at that moment, is there any fear or hesitation that, like, hey, people are going to read this and they're either going to think it's crap, or they're just going to come out and tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about? Because I have this fear every time I put something on my channel that I'm going to get somebody coming across one of my briefings who's just an absolute master on the subject area, and they're just going to tear me apart.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm eager to find people to talk to my subject about. I mean, my wife Ann and I, she's here, and most of my day is spent at home, and so I'm working in my office, and then I come out and I'm all excited because I found something, and I'll say something to her, and God bless her, she's kind of like, oh, that's great, that's wonderful. And if I keep going about, and then I found out about this guy, and on this next war patrol, here's what happened, and I can sort of see her eyes rolling back in her head. So, so to find somebody that's willing to engage me, or I don't care if they tell me I'm wrong. I mean, in the business I am of teaching, the strategy and war course for the War College, there's lots of, there's never really a right answer. So I'm very happy to do that. And when I presented that paper at the McMullen History Symposium, I was on a panel, and the panel moderator was a gentleman by the name of Craig Simons, who is a very esteemed naval historian and author of many books. And so he's the guy who reads my paper and then basically, comments on it. And he took me to task for a couple of things, and we had and I loved it. It was fantastic. And to be able to talk to him and hear what he has to say, that's one of the things that I'm really hoping to have more of, find people that would like to engage on the subject.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I've suspected that myself, that there's a group of people out there who have an interest in these subjects, but basically you don't have anybody to talk to. So to write an article or to upload a briefing to YouTube It's nice.
And there's a lot of nice people out there that will give you their thoughts, and then there's others that are probably not quite so nice that'll tell you you're an idiot or be condescending, and it's like, okay, fine, dude. If that's where you want to go, then
Yeah.
that's fine. But
So this is not one of the 10 questions, but it's something that I'm thinking about it as we're talking. You went to the Naval Academy. You studied history. You worked 30 years in the Navy. You're staying involved with history. You're writing. You're looking forward. That's a very different. That's a very traditional track, I would call it. Compare that to, let's for a moment, like John Parshall.
Yeah.
So I was, I've watched some videos on him, and he has a degree in geology. I mean, he has a degree in geology. I'm a civil engineer. We were talking about Drakenifeld's YouTube channel, the British guy who does, he's got over 300,000 subscribers. He's a civil engineer. You hear,
Yeah.
So we have the traditional scholar of history training and education route, but now we have all these new people who are coming in. Maybe they don't have that formal training in history and research, but they're out there. They're out there making content for YouTube. They're out there on Twitch. They're writing. They're creating. They're learning. How do you feel about this new group of historians kind of coming in who maybe haven't had like the classical training?
Oh, I think it's awesome. I mean, we like what we like. We enjoy doing what we enjoy doing. And if somebody, I mean, what they have maybe they've got a different life at work, and they come home and they want to spend their time doing something completely different, and then maybe even taking it further. I think that's fantastic. And I was on, I can't remember what it was. I was watching a webinar or something online with John Parshall was on there. And they were asking for questions. So I submitted the question to him, and he came back and basically said, hey, I don't think we're going to get to answer your question, but here's my email address. Why don't you send it to me and we could talk about it offline? And so I did. And he's been very, very helpful. He gave me some feedback on my topic and kind of some ways to go. So, anybody that's out there, whatever you like doing, I mean, go do it and love it. And if you find you got a passion for it, and like him, you want to start a website on the combined fleet, or you want to write an amazing book on the Battle of Midway that changes the world's perception of certain things about it, go do it. Have a great time.
I agree. Your article, Bleak December. Let's start with the big picture. So it's the 1930s. What is the U.S. plan for a potential Pacific War with Japan?
So the plan, which had been around and had been modified since the early 20th century, was known as War Plan Orange. And I'm sure a lot of people know that the United States coded their war plans by country, by color. So Japan was orange, and Germany was black. Great Britain was red. Believe it or not, we had a war plan to go to war with Great Britain. So War Plan Orange kind of morphed itself over the years. And I'm sure a lot of you guys know this, but if you really want to find out about War Plan Orange, you got to read, I think it's Edward Miller wrote the book on War Plan Orange, which is just a Bible, and it's got some great stuff in there that shows how it's morphed over time. But the Asiatic Fleet, which is the smallest of the U.S. Navy's three fleets, so small that it had no capital ships, just one heavy cruiser, one light cruiser, about a baker's dozen of destroyers, and then a few submarines. That was out there kind of more of as a show the flag type force. Wasn't meant to necessarily defeat the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was everybody kind of knew it was going to be a speed bump, and its job was just going to be show the flag, and then when war starts, find a way to not get yourself steamrollered and wait for the Pacific Fleet to come across from Pearl Harbor, where it was eventually from 1940 onward. And then, relieve the beleaguered Asiatic Fleet and the Army forces that were in the Philippines. So that was kind of the game plan for the Asiatic Fleet, was really just survive.
Right. So War Plan Orange, was it a preemptive plan, or was it a defensive plan? Like, in assuming that we're attacked first.
Yeah, no, it assumed we were attacked first, so it was somewhat defensive in nature. The whole idea is that the Japanese would do something, we'd end up at war, and then the Asiatic Fleet's going to do what it does to survive, defending what it can. But the big deal was, how does the main battle force, the U.S. fleet, which was by then the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, how does that get across the ocean to do what it's going to do in the major Mahanian style battle against the Imperial Japanese Navy that would decide the war.
So what was the role of U.S. submarines with the Asiatic Fleet and with War Plan Orange in general?
So the submarines of the Asiatic Fleet, up until I think the early 30s, there was a dozen of these old S-boats, World War I vintage S-class submarines. Right. They were, back then the submarines were so small they didn't even get a name. All they got was a number, S-36, S-41, whatever it was. But there was about a dozen of them out there, and eventually by the mid-30s it was down to 6. So there was one division of submarines out there. By the time that Admiral Thomas Hart took over as the commander-in-chief of the Asiatic Fleet in 1939, he wanted to build up the size of the Asiatic Fleet. He was asking for reinforcements. Send me more. I'm going to need more if I'm going to have to do what you want. We think we're going to have to do. And the Navy was not sending any. They weren't sending any battleships. They weren't even sending any cruisers. They didn't even send any more destroyers. But they were amenable to sending out more submarines. So. And from 39 to 41, we got up to 17 submarines, including there was 13 of the first fleet type submarines, which are the P class, the Porpoise class. And the fleet type was called that because the idea was it had the speed, the range, and the endurance to be able to operate in conjunction with the fleet. So they've got much more ability to operate in the Pacific. They put some, air conditioning units on them, which was it doesn't seem like an important thing, but it was huge when you're operating in the tropics.
Oh yeah.
And so we got up to 17, and then in the last few months before the war started, there was an entire new squadron. Submarine Squadron 2 was shifted from Pearl Harbor to Manila, and so there was 29 submarines in Manila when the war started, and that was the largest concentration of modern American submarines in the U.S. Navy. So those guys they had certain missions. They were going to go out and obviously do their reconnaissance, do their reporting, attack Japanese shipping, and of course, the idea of, is it going to be, when we say shipping, are they attacking warships? Are they attacking merchant ships, or both? That took a while to figure out. That's the old question of unrestricted warfare. Are we going to do it or are we not going to do it? And essentially, as they got close to the war, the decision was made that, if we go to war with Japan, we will be executing unrestricted submarine warfare. And so that gave the submarines a priority of targets. And they still, if you still saw an aircraft carrier or battleship, that was number one. And maybe cruisers were next. But then after that, hey, let's go get the tankers, let's get the freighters to attrite the merchant fleets. So that was kind of the Asiatic Fleet submarines' job. The submarines over in Pearl Harbor, their job would have been to travel with the battle force as it came across the Pacific to find the Imperial Japanese Navy, to relieve the Philippines, and to conduct that big decisive battle fleet to fleet. And of course, with Pearl Harbor, all of a sudden that was no longer happening. So submarines out of Pearl Harbor were sent basically on the same kind of war patrols as the submarines out of Manila were, to look for the Japanese targets wherever they could.
Yeah. Now I have Samuel L. Morrison's The Rising Sun in the Pacific. This is volume 3 of his series on U.S. naval operations. And in there, he has a nice summary of that month in December with the Philippines, and he actually lists out all the subs. And I'm not going to run through the list of subs, but you have around December 1941, you have 4 S-class boats, which are constructed back between 1919 and 1925.
Yeah.
And then in addition to those, you have 7 Porpoise class, 6 Salmon class, 10 Sargo class. And those 3 classes of boats, they had been designed and they were being built in the mid to late 1930s. So they are, quote, modern boats. But just talking a little bit about these submarines, where they were at from a technology standpoint, they wouldn't have had, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding, they would not have had either the SD air search radar or the SJ surface search radar. I don't.
You're correct. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And there's the active sonar system. I think it's the WFA series. I believe that that didn't begin entering service for submarines until like mid 1942. So, I'm assuming these boats that they have an RDF loop, and maybe they have a radar detector. But largely, it sounds like from a technology standpoint, they were actually where the Germans were at the start of the war in 1939.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. They didn't have a lot of those bells and whistles things that started coming in the late 1941 and 1942 period. In fact, the commander of the Asiatic Fleet submarines was a guy by the name of John E. Wilkes, and he was on Admiral Hart's shore staff of the Asiatic Fleet. And he's the guy, so he was the Commodore, right? He was the submarine squadron Commodore when the war started, and they kind of reorganized for success there in a wartime environment and called it CSAF, Commander Submarines Asiatic Fleet. But kind of after the dust settles in the March-April timeframe, and the Asiatic Fleet has got its butts kicked all the way down to Australia in a kind of a losing effort. After that, he signs off on an action report, 72 pages, written mostly by his chief staff officer, Commander, later Captain, later Admiral, Jimmy Fife, which really talked all about the problems that they had, what went wrong, and had a lot of recommendations in it. And in there, that's where he's got, hey, we've got to have radar. We've got to get that on every single submarine ASAP, as well as other modernization ideas. Right. So if anybody can ever get their hands on it, it's Morrison in that volume that you talked about. He refers to it as the Wilkes Report. But it's really called War Activities Submarines. You can actually find it on fold3.com. You go into the World War II Navy, War Diaries or something like that, and you can find it and take a look at it. It's an amazing document.
Yeah. While we're talking about submarines, I did tease this interview a little bit on Twitter, and I actually got a question from Twitter and this is unplanned, but I'm just going to go ahead and ask you. And the question was, what was American doctrine? What was American submarine doctrine as far as conducting attacks? And I'll set this up, okay? So with the Kriegsmarine and U-boats, it was pretty much doctrine that you were going to conduct night surfaced torpedo attacks from under 1,000 meters. That's how they envisioned the U-boats attacking it. That's what they did in World War I, and it works well at the start of the Second World War until the British start bringing into online various radar systems. But what was doctrine, or what was considered the proper way to conduct attacks by submarines for the U.S.?
Yeah. So it's interesting when you talk about doctrine. Of course, the U.S. Navy, you use the word doctrine, and everybody gets all nervous and jerky, right? We don't have doctrine. We have procedures, and we have tactics, and but doctrine is just too confining. And of course, there's the famous quotes, and I don't remember who it was from. I think it was from a Soviet general later on that says, you know, the Americans, they didn't even follow their own doctrine. That's what makes it so hard to, you know, to fight against those guys. But yeah, the submarine force kind of trained late in the 30s. They were training primarily for submerged attacks, and a lot of it was driven by the fear of aircraft. And it was almost I consider it to be a little bit, not necessarily irrational, but it was they had overblown the threat of aircraft. And during the fleet battle problems, the submarine guys would go out, and if they were detected by an aircraft, those skippers got a dressing down. How could you get detected? What were you doing? You know, now you've ruined your chances. So they were basically, the submarine force leadership was driving the submariners to stay deep and actually conduct their attacks from below periscope depth based on sound data. Well, heck, that's tough to do in 2022, much less 1941. So, you know, and I think a lot of the submariners also thought, hey, you know, if I could just get a look, you know, let me get the periscope up. That's worth 1,000, you know, inputs from the sound guy.
Right.
If I can just get a bearing from the periscope. So, and it's kind of a misconception. If you read things, people say, well, yeah, the American submariners, they were taught to attack from deep. Well, if you look at the actual data in that Wilkes report, and he's got a list of every attack that was made, how it was done, what the range was, how many torpedoes were fired, and specifically, were they on the surface, were they at periscope depth, or were they deep? It was way less than 10% of the shots in those first 4 months of the war were from deep, below periscope depth. So that tells you that the submariners themselves even didn't have a whole lot of confidence in that, and so they wanted to either be at periscope depth or on the surface. And you know, we can talk a lot about that and how that worked out for them in the war. But you know, essentially, one of the problems that we'll see here with the Asiatic Fleet submarines is, you know, during the day they spent their time submerged. Okay, right. And again, it was fear of being detected. They didn't have radar to be able to tell, you know, find out that there was an aircraft coming in on them. So they spent their time deep during the surface, coming up maybe once an hour or even less to take a look around through the periscope. Well, you know, if you stick 4 feet of periscope out, your horizon's only about I don't forget what it is. It's 1.14 times the square root. So it's only like 5,000 yards away to the horizon. So if a ship's, you know, 3 or 4 miles away, you're not even going to see it maybe. So,
like when I'm on the beach in South Carolina with a pair of binoculars standing right there at the edge of the water, I mean, I'm only looking out about 3 miles.
Right.
You know,
and so the submarines were, you know, during the day while they're deep or at periscope depth, they're really not giving themselves a good chance to find anything. And then at night they come up on the surface to recharge the batteries, you know, put the lookouts up there, see what you can find. Well, it's night, and guess who didn't really do a very good job at training for night surface tactics, and that's the U.S. Submarine Force. So. Yeah. And as we'll see when we get into the, you know, engagements with the Japanese and trying to break through some of their escorting screens to get at the merchant ships, it didn't go too well.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, but let me ask you another question first. Can you just tell me about the leadership structure for the Asiatic Fleet and what their plan was for defending the Philippine Islands?
Yeah, so I mean, the commander-in-chief of the Asiatic Fleet, we said, was Admiral Tommy Hart, and he was a submariner. He had come up. I think he first got involved before World War I. He ran the torpedo station in Newport, Rhode Island, so he's very familiar with the torpedoes. And then, having got that stink on him, they eventually put him in charge of a submarine division. And I think he might have been, well, I can't remember where it was, but he you know, moved around quite a bit. He actually took a submarine division out to the Philippines. So he was like, at that point, when the war broke out, he was the senior serving submarine officer in the entire Navy. So he had a lot of faith in those submarines. He thought that they were going to be his major striking force, since all he had a heavy cruiser, and at that point he had 2 light cruisers and 13 destroyers. So and all those surface ships got sent to the south. They were all kind of moved away from Manila before the war broke out, because everybody out there was pretty much convinced that war was imminent. And Hart himself, said, "Hey, this is coming." And he went back and forth with Washington, D.C. over what to do with his surface ships, whether to fight them from Manila Bay or send them south. And eventually it ended up he sent them south. But so he was the head guy. And then John Wilkes, who was a commander, put on captain in January of 42, later went on to be a rear admiral. He was the CSAF, Commander Submarines Asiatic Fleet, and so he ran from the things from the shore side. He had his deputy, his chief of staff was Commander Jimmy Fife, and then he had several, probably I think it was 5 post-command division commanders. So these are guys that all had command of submarines, and now they were in charge of a division of anywhere from 4 to 6 submarines. And those guys, he kind of formed them to be his materiel officer and his operation officers. And so essentially, it was a very small core group of this CSAF group, and they were the ones that were kind of directing the submarine operations from ashore.
So CSAF and the staff, they had been thinking about this problem, the defense of the Philippines. They had been thinking about this for a while, and they came to the conclusion that ultimately, if the Philippines were invaded, the Japanese would probably come from Formosa, and they would probably land at Lingayen Gulf. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. That had been something that both Army and Navy planners had foreseen for 20 years, that eventually, if this thing, if the balloon goes up, the Japanese, when they eventually come to take the Philippines, they're going to land in Lingayen Gulf. And actually, that's what they did. So we kind of knew where the main threat axis and where the main threat point, landing point, was going to be. And we sort of still didn't do all that well.
Right, because from reading your article and also from Morrison's book, it sounds like, as we're approaching December 7th, it sounds like they opt for kind of like a balanced, kind of like picket surveillance approach. We're going to have subs around the Philippines so we can get early detection on possible invasion forces. But it doesn't sound like they're really focusing on that distance between Lingayen Gulf and Formosa.
Well, what they kind of decided was that they were going to send a percentage of the boats were going to go for the away game, right? They were going to go and kind of operate off the Japanese bases. So that's Formosa, Hainan Island, Indochina down at Cameron Bay, which was a recent base that they had taken over from the French. And that was those, so there's 7 boats that were going to be involved at distance. And so they figured that would be great. They'd be able to report back, hey, I've seen a convoy, or these guys are headed here, or whatever. And then you had another tier of submarines that were going to be operating in and around the Philippines. And, I think it was probably a mistake, but they put a lot of boats to the north and on the east side of the main island of Luzon. There was a lot of boats that were in the southern to the south of Luzon, operating in the inner island areas. And then there was 6 that eventually were kind of stationed in defensive, I guess you would call them defensive patrol areas along the western Luzon coast. So that's in the South China Sea. And those are the guys that are kind of, okay, if they come, we'll be there to reach them or see them and attack them. And that was the game plan, and it sort of makes sense. But where they erred was, well, I guess I have to go back to November. I mean, Hart was getting war warning messages, right, from the Chief of Naval Operations, Betty Stark. And so he knew that things were about to happen. And more than anybody else, maybe in the entire U.S. Navy, Hart being out in the Western Pacific, he had a sense that this is all going to happen. The Japanese they're going to do something, and I'm right in the crosshairs. much more so than MacArthur. I mean, General MacArthur, God bless him, but he was delusional, and he was living on hope. Hey, nothing's going to happen till April of 1942. That was MacArthur's line. We're all fine.
Yeah.
By April 42, I'll have built up all my forces and all these Filipinos that are I'm training them. They'll be trained and equipped, and we'll be able to handle whatever happens. Well, Hart had decided, no, this war is coming, and it's coming sooner rather than later, which is, I think, fantastic. The problem is he didn't deploy his submarines. He had by the 2nd and 3rd of December, they sent 2 submarines to sea. One up to Lingayen Gulf, S-36, and one to kind of provide overwatch of the San Bernardino Strait to the east of southern Luzon. So there's 2 boats at sea, and that's it. When the war starts, when the Japanese attack, 2 submarines at sea. Man, why did not he deploy some of these guys earlier on practice war patrols or just reconnaissance? Hey, go out and see what's going on. There was a lot of messages flying around about Japanese convoys being sighted, and they're moving up and down the coast of China. Wouldn't that have been nice to deploy your submarines out there, give them a little operational experience, particularly those 12 that had just arrived from Pearl Harbor within the few weeks before then? And you're going to see something, and you report it. And this is where I had an interesting discussion with Craig Simons over my paper, because he said he actually, I mean, it was a great point. He said, well, Hart was told to have a defensive deployment and be ready. So maybe he was a little, nervous about sending submarines out there and having them, get detected, get in a scrap, and next thing you know, somebody shoots at somebody else, and then we're at war, and somebody can say, the Japanese can say, well, there was a submarine, and so all submarines, of course, are evil and bad, so I attacked them, and and then the submarine, the Americans are being accused of starting the war. So maybe that's why he didn't do that, and there's some merit to that thought, but the one thing that I found in doing my research is that in late November, because all the surface ships had been sent south, one of the things that the Navy decided they had to do is the 4th Marine Regiment was in Shanghai on the coast of China.
Yeah.
And they wanted to get those guys out of there, because if the balloon goes up, those guys are all going to be lost. And hey, wouldn't it be nice to have them in the Philippines for defense eventually? And so they sent a couple of large transports over there, but they didn't have any destroyers to escort them. So they actually sent submarines to go with those guys to escort them, and that's not not normally a submarine mission set to escort surface ships, but that's what they did. And sure enough, they got seen by the Japanese. And in fact, one of the submarines, and I think it was Permit, if I remember right, in some rough weather, took some waves down the conning tower hatch that shorted out a bunch of equipment, and she lost propulsion. So she's bobbing out there on the surface in the middle of the South China Sea, and a bunch of Japanese destroyers are circling around, looking at it, what's going on, and then kind of left. So we had that interaction, and there was no shots fired. No, there was no trigger-happy event that occurred, and so why not, send more of them out there? And you get these skippers and you shake your finger in their face and say, your job's to go out there, reconnaissance, report, don't get yourselves detected if you don't have to be detected, and don't start anything. And I think that would have made a huge difference in what eventually happened, because they would have had much better situational awareness on what was going on with the Japanese prior to the 8th of December.
I agree. So December 7th happens. Pearl Harbor's taken out, and this begins a chain reaction of the Japanese invading and expanding all over in the Western Pacific. And after Pearl Harbor, it's like the 3rd weekend of December when the Japanese go ahead and begin landing operations at Lingayen Gulf. So ultimately, how effective were the submarines in the defense of the Philippines?
It hurts me to say, as a submariner, but pretty much ineffective. there had been a few interactions before the landings at Lingayen, and that was on the 21st of December is when that actually happened. There had been a few interactions, and the submarines had, I think by that point, Swordfish had made several attacks off of Hainan Island or Formosa, and she actually sank the first Japanese ship to be sunk, the Atsutasen Maru. That was on the 16th or the 17th of December. So there were some things that had gone on, but there had also been some indications. Some of the boats had, made attacks from very short range, kind of can't miss shots, and then nothing happened. No hits. Right. And they had seen a few premature explosions. So the submariners were starting to get a sense that this ominous, feeling in the pit of your stomach that, hey, some of our torpedoes don't seem to be working quite right. Right. But when we finally made contact with the Japanese invasion convoy, it was finally done, as it approached Lingayen Gulf by the, which boat was it? Oh, it was Stingray. Stingray was the one that detected them. Reported, wasn't particularly aggressive, and essentially, maneuvered around a lot trying to get a shot, didn't take any, and the entire convoy, which was in fact the largest Japanese invasion convoy of the entire war, over 80 ships, got past the submarines into Lingayen Gulf and started offloading. When Wilkes back in Manila got the message from Stingray, he basically said, all right, all bets are off. All you guys that are in these stations, and for submarines, and this sometimes seems counterintuitive to people because they think, well, submarines, little tiny submarine, big ocean, they're not going to bounce, they're not going to hit each other. Well, no, it happens. So you never put two submarines in the same water so that they can have an opportunity to have a collision. So they're always separated. Well, Wilkes dispensed with that. He said, everybody, all you 5 other boats, into Lingayen Gulf. Get in there, attack the transports, attack. And each of them tried over the next couple of days, and essentially some of them were half-hearted. Some of them were more aggressive, but actually only one submarine, the S-38, one of those old S boats, got itself into Lingayen Gulf, and under the command of Moon Chappell, a Naval Academy football fullback in the class of class 1930. He got his boat in there, took a couple shots, missed, got bombed, got attacked, and finally sank one of the Japanese transports, and went through all kinds of adventures before barely making it out of Lingayen Gulf and limping back to Manila. But that entire event, which Clay Blair, who's the author of Silent Victory and a World War II submariner himself, in his book, he called it the Battle of Lingayen Gulf, except he put the air quotes battle, because it really wasn't a battle. It was a piss poor performance by the American submarines.
So you and I via email, we had talked about that a little bit, and initially, my response was, well, you know what, if you just drop German subcrews into the U.S. boats, and if you have a Kriegsmarine command staff on shore in Manila, problem solved, because they know how to use U-boats and they know how to fight. But it's a much more complicated question, and I'll give you an example. The distance from the southern tip of Formosa to Lingayen Gulf is only about 500 nautical miles. So for a convoy, that's about 4 days steaming time. And that short distance, it makes it really hard to organize I was going to say U-boats. That's such a short distance unless you have a really well laid out plan ahead of time. You're not even going to have enough time to spot the convoy and then marshal your other subs to converge on it. This is not the Atlantic, where, because something that a lot of people don't understand, the Germans were cracking the British naval codes just like the British were cracking the German naval codes. So, oftentimes the Germans would know when a convoy was going to be leaving the eastern seaboard, and you've got 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 nautical, you've got that whole distance to organize and place your U-boats so that you can grind that convoy down. But you would not have that opportunity with an invasion force coming from Formosa to the Philippines.
Yeah, you've got there's a lot less time to react. The other thing that's missing is what a great place to send up some reconnaissance aircraft. Send up those Pat Wing 10 PBY Catalinas to go out and find what's going on out there, or use those B-17s from MacArthur's Far East Air Force. Well, unfortunately, a lot of those B-17s are gone now after
Yeah.
the 8th of December, and the Catalinas of Pat Wing 10, because essentially after the ports, but it wasn't clear where anybody was going. It wasn't like, oh, I see an invasion convoy. It looked like it headed to Lingayen Gulf. It wasn't anything like that. It was more like I saw some ships, and here, they were headed in this direction. This was the course, and so nobody could really tell, was that an invasion convoy or not. But by the time that they figured it out, they only had, essentially the first detection of that invasion convoy was on the evening of the 20th. And during that night, they ended up entering the Lingayen Gulf. So there was not a whole lot of time to react. The other thing, you talk about the Germans and U-boats and the wolf packs and have them converging. Clay Blair, in his book, he also said, "Well, why didn't we use wolf pack tactics?" And I've got to find some more research on this. The Americans weren't there yet, right? And the Germans weren't there yet in September 1939 either. They weren't doing backs. It took them a while to figure it out and set it up.
Yeah.
So I always thought that was a little bit far-fetched, that we would be ready to do that at the start of the war, to use wolf packs tactics together. We really didn't start doing that until 1943. It took us a while to figure that out.
Yeah, and it's actually around everybody talks about May 1943, but in 1943 you have Huff Duff on surface ships now, and in order for a group of U-boats, because you made the point about submarines not occupying the same space when they're attacking because of that inherent danger. The Germans understood this as well. So it was a very carefully choreographed operation to have a group of boats and a wolf pack conducting sustained attacks on a convoy, because it was the same kind of thing. You don't want two U-boats on opposite sides of a convoy shooting at each other, right?
Sure.
So that requires a lot of radio communication between the boats and between BDU. And by 1943, with Huff Duff and the ability to very rapidly triangulate radio signals, it's really hard to even do that anymore. But I think when the U.S. is doing Wolfpack attacks, they're operating in a different environment where the Japanese, from a technology standpoint, they were not where the U.S. and where the British were.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah. So, so what were the lessons learned by the naval leadership based on what happened with the submarines in the Philippines?
So in that Wilkes report from April 1942, he laid down a number of things. I mean, he mentioned that they'd underestimated their enemy. They thought that the Japanese performed really well in anti-submarine warfare. I think it's fair to ask whether they had significantly underestimated the Japanese, or whether there might be an element that we had significantly overestimated our own capabilities. In fact, Jimmy Fife, in his oral history, he talks about that. And he said, yeah, we underestimated them, but we also thought we were much better than we really were. So there's those factors. They looked at where to position the submarines. Wilkes kind of decided, I had all these boats in defensive patrol areas at the far end of where we expected them to show up, and maybe it's better to have them out in the middle of the transit lanes where they've got a better chance to see things, right. And then they can kind of trail and get attacks in as the ships are moving around. And I think that's a fair assessment. But one of the things that nobody really talked much about, either Wilkes or Hart, is in general, are submarines a good defensive weapon? I mean, are they somebody that you should put someplace to defend a coastline? Quite frankly, in the early years of submarines, that was what all they were good for, because they didn't have the legs to get out there and go places. But by 1941, you've got this fantastic offensive weapon. And, you being a German U-boat guy and me being an American submariner, we might have a good discussion over a beverage about this. But I would argue that the American submarines in 1941 were the best submarines in the entire world. That platform was an amazing platform that the Germans would have sold their soul to get their hands on it and use that in the Atlantic. But you're tying it down in these, defensive patrol areas. And, can a submarine force of, you name it, somewhere between 10 and 20 submarines, can they defend a coastline against an invading force? And I would say no. I'd say that strategy was not going to be effective. And the Americans pretty much learned that. They needed to get out there. They needed to play the away game, be out along the transit lanes, and that's where they were going to make their money. So those, I think, are some of the, the big lessons. They, figured out a lot of stuff about, hey, we need to have that radar. There's a lot of things that they determined we kind of suck at night warfare. Why don't we own the night? And the Japanese had trained for it and were so much better than the Americans, and that came as a big shock. And so we had to spend some time doing that. We were getting detected all the time at night on the surface as the boats are trying to penetrate Japanese escort the groups, and to the point where Wilkes actually wondered. He said, "I think they've got radar. They're snapping us up every time. I think the Japanese destroyers have radar," and they didn't.
Yeah, I looked into this, and the Japanese don't even begin deploying radar on large ships until late 1942.
That is correct. Yeah. But, Wilkes was so certain. How could this be? We're getting our butts kicked when we're on the surface. They must have radar. So that was certainly an important thing that they figured out. And then, they took a good hard look at the performance of the skippers, and that's actually an insert in the Wilkes report that was actually initially for official use only, because they essentially talked about, personnel matters, and this skipper, broke down and had to be relieved, and the skipper was unaggressive, and so it was kind of sensitive. You can find that on Fold 3, they do have the actual information there, but there was several skippers that had to be relieved for various reasons. A couple of them by their own request, lost confidence. One guy who I think is just an amazing submariner, a guy by the name of Tyrrell Jacobs, was skipper of the Sargo. He made a few attacks, was shocked that he wasn't getting hits, decided he was going to, double, triple check, have his XO come in and check them, get into it, can't miss situations, and still didn't get any hits. And he decided, you know what? I think our torpedoes are running deep. Well, guess what? They were running deep. And he said, you know what? I think we've got a problem with the Mark VI magnetic exploder. Yeah, we did have a problem with the Mark VI magnetic exploder. So in January 1942, this one guy had basically figured it out and told Wilkes, who then went back to the Bureau of Ordnance and said, we think we have problems with the Mark 14 running deep and the Mark 6 magnetic exploder not working. And the Bureau of Ordnance comes back and says, you know what, we've looked at that and it might be running deeper, but only for the first, 800 or 1,000 yards. After that, it's fine. Shouldn't be a problem. And the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, there's no problem whatsoever with it. And so you ought to teach your skippers to shoot straight. Threw it back on the operating field, which, just even to this day just gets my goat. So that's one of, the whole thing about, the general, if you talk to a lot of people and you talk about, some U.S. submarines at the start of the war, they go, oh yeah, if they know anything, oh yeah, it was cautious skippers and bad torpedoes, and that was it. Well, yeah, those two factors were there, particularly the torpedoes. That's huge. Cautious skippers, well, a couple of them were. A couple of them were extremely aggressive and very good at what they did. And then the rest of them were, doing their very best, good, solid skippers. So I
Yeah.
would argue that I don't necessarily agree that cautious skippers was a problem. I mean, I think that it was probably within the realm of averages how those guys were performing. But
Yeah.
the guys that aren't going to do well, yeah, get them out of there and put new guys in.
So that's interesting that we're talking about this because in preparation for this, I spent a little time going over numbers with U-boat captains. And so in World War II, you have about 1,400 guys who cycle through U-boat command positions in the German Navy. So that's a lot of guys, I think. But of the 11 million tons or so of merchant shipping that was sunk by the Germans in World War II, 60% of that tonnage was sunk by 6% of the captains. So what does that tell you? What it tells me is that it's that age-old adage that in any organization, 20% of the people do 80% of the work. The vast majority of U-boat captains spent their careers not ever sinking a ship, or maybe one or two.
Yeah, and a lot of those guys, those outstanding U-boat skippers, were early war.
Yes, they were. Mm-hmm.
During kind of the happy times there, in particular off the U.S. Atlantic coast in 1940, early 1942. I mean, those guys. There was just a couple of those boats there, and those guys just mopped up. Of course, we weren't too brilliant about being ready to go to war.
So, what would you have done differently in defense of the Philippine Islands?
Okay, couple things come to mind here. I mean, the first is sending the boats out on, just getting them underway before the 8th of December. And out of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Thomas Withers, who was the commander of Submarines Pacific, he had sent a few boats out on practice war patrols to give them experience of operating and et cetera. I think had Wilkes done that, that would have been a pretty good thing to do. It would have been smart to get the boats out, have them walking the ground, preparing the battle space, reporting back in on what they see. So the whole idea, in the end, one of the things that just boggles my mind is, you've got 29 submarines operating out of Manila, and on the day the war starts, only 2 of them are underway. There's 27.
That doesn't make any sense to me. Right, because you're patrolling what I consider to be a small area, and you have, even the S-boats have a 5,000 nautical mile range. I mean, you could have very easily had just like a 50-50 rotation with 50% of your boats at sea, even for just a month, because then they've got plenty. There's plenty of time that they can stay on station and just rotate those 2 groups, and then you always have a pretty solid presence. And then maybe just focus on the anticipated shipping lanes between the Philippines and Formosa. I don't know.
Yeah, and 12 of those boats had just arrived in November from Pearl Harbor. Why not get them out operating? Hey, welcome to Westpac. It's different out here. Go out and operate, work up your crews a little bit, get used to operations, and oh, by the way, do what submarines do really well, which is find stuff and be sneaky and report it back to us and tell us what you're seeing. So I think that would have paid off a lot of benefits to actually get a lot of those boats underway and have them out there when the balloon went up. The other thing that I think is important that wasn't done is they really didn't give an appropriate briefing to fire up those skippers before they went out on patrol. As they were gathering them all up to give them their assignments on the 8th of December, when it was, hey, we're at war now. A lot of the division commanders and CSAF were briefing the skippers to essentially be somewhat cautious while they're out there. And one division commander, Sunshine Murray, who later went on to be a 4-star, he said in his oral history, he said, "Hey, I told the skippers, don't go out there and try and earn the Medal of Honor. Your submarines are all we've got. The surface ships aren't around. It's just us boats, and so it's important that you bring them back." Well, that's not what you tell people if you want them to go out and kick ass and take names. and so you've got to certainly be circumspect about it, and then you don't want recklessness, but you got to tell your guys to go out there and be aggressive. And oh, by the way, if you're not, we may have to hold you accountable, because we need you to have results. Go out, get the results, get the take. Put torpedoes into hulls. That's what we need you to do. And if you don't, if you demonstrate that you can't or won't do that, then you're not going to be in command long. So it's not a fear thing. It's just get your guys in the mindset of, hey, we're at war and you need to go out and do the business of war, not necessarily, hey, go out there and be careful so you can come back and tell us what you see.
Right, and we talked about this a little bit over email, but it was a completely different mindset with the Kriegsmarine and in the U-boats. Those skippers were absolutely fearless, bordering on reckless every time they conducted an attack. But I think, as you pointed out, it's just a different psychology. I mean, Germany is fighting literally for its life every day, and there's that motivation with every sailor, with every U-boat commander, that we have to give it 120% each and every attack, each and every war patrol, regardless of the potential hazards. But really, being in the United States, I mean, on the one hand, you could just say, you know what, if the Japanese roll through the Pacific, I mean, what does it really matter to us? Because it's not like they're going to invade the West Coast. It's just a different mindset. It's like, whatever happens, given enough time and our resources, we can undo whatever the Japanese have done. But it's not like the attitude, or it's not like it doesn't seem like there's the urgency. Like, if our boats don't get in there and sink half of that convoy, America is lost. I mean, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I see your point there, but I do think that those submariners out there in the early part of the war, they wanted to do well. They wanted to go in and show themselves and show the world that they were a force to be reckoned with, and that they were going to do their job against the Imperial Japanese Navy. And so what's so difficult about this whole thing is that they wanted to do well, and for several reasons, torpedoes, if you want to talk about skippers, you want to talk about not being put in the right place, having a poor operational scheme, whatever it is, it didn't work out that well. And it hurt. I mean, this was not something like, round one to the Japanese, let's go. No, those submariners were furious. They were disappointed. They were angry that things weren't going on. And as they retreated throughout the rest of that campaign down towards the Dutch East Indies, trying to make a stand at the Malay barrier, and then eventually retreating all the way to Australia, to Western Australia, that was not a warm and fuzzy group that was thinking, no big deal. The West Coast of the United States is still safe. They felt like they'd performed poorly. They were disappointed and angry that why did this happen? Why aren't we doing better? And so that's the seeds, I think, of the rest of the U.S. submarine campaign in the Pacific War was set right then and there. And you had to have, later there's a few personnel changes. You'd get, Wilkes moves on. He'd been out in the Far East for over 2 years. He heads back stateside, and he's relieved by Rear Admiral, later Vice Admiral Charlie Lockwood, Uncle Charlie, who, really at that point, he's the guy. When you think about leadership, Lockwood was the perfect guy to come in there. That was what he'd trained his entire life, is to command a submarine force. And there's a guy that really made a difference out there. Took care of his submariners, instilled some fire in them. He's the guy that pushed really hard to find and fix the Mark 14 torpedo problem and the Mark 6 exploder problem, and got them headed on the right track so that their performance got to where it was supposed to be and beyond. And so that the dotted line from December 41 to April or May of 42, And then you got ... going to, well, what's happening in 43, 44, and 45? It's a big difference, and it's almost like, you can't even recognize it. But the way I look at it, those guys, those submariners that were out there on the front lines getting steamrolled and trying to do their best at the start of the war, we owe a lot to them, because they were the one that were taking the licks, learning the lessons, finding out things that worked and didn't work. And some of them paid with their lives. I mean, we lost 4 boats during that campaign. Sea Lion was sunk in Manila Bay on the 10th of December. We had one that ran aground in the Dutch East Indies, and then Perch and Shark were both sunk by Japanese ASW forces. And so those sailors, those submariners, they put it all on the line. I think at the end they were disappointed how it turned out, and they wanted to make it better, and we owe a lot to them.
Do you think that, because I'm a coastal submarine and a diesel electric guy, okay, that's really my interest. Do you think the U.S. would have benefited from a coastal type submarine operating out of the Philippines? And I'm thinking about Lingayen Gulf itself.
No, nope, I don't. And Hart actually is one of these guys who, one of his things, he was on the general board, the Navy's general board, and he was never thrilled with the fleet type. He was like, yeah, that's fine. But, he was one of these guys that in many ways was looking back to the way it was. I remember when I was on submarines and they were smaller, but boy, we did great stuff, and you could really do a lot with those little guys. And so as we were building these fleet type boats, Hart was the guy who basically recommended, hey, we need to have a smaller submarine that we can use. And I think he was looking at situations like that. And so he actually, because of him, we ended up with I think it was the Mackerel and the Marlin, which were built I think they were actually commissioned in 1941. They're about the size of an S boat, but they had a lot of some of the enhancements of the fleet type boats, smaller boats. And guess what the Mackerel and Marlin did in World War II? Zip, nada. They were essentially, they didn't have the legs, they didn't have the range, the endurance, couldn't carry all those weapons, and so they ended up being training submarines. It was a waste of money. So the real situation was get the most out of those fleet type boats. If you go small, of course, today in this day and age, everybody's like, well, smaller's better. You can get it into a smaller package and that'll be great, instead of having this big thing that costs all this money. Well, from my perspective, even the small stuff costs money. If you're going to pack it up and make it a technological wizard, that's going to cost you money just to do that. So, they had the best submarine in the world, and they just needed to operate them correctly.
So, okay, so this is getting me thinking, and we're kind of wrapping up here. We really only have one more question, but I want to throw this one in here, and this is completely off topic. But I'm thinking right now about the Baltic, and the news the last day has been about Russian LS landing ships transiting through the Baltic. Presumably, it's thought that they may end up going through the Med and then up to the Black Sea. If let's say you're BDU for the Bundesmarine right now, and you've got 6 212 Type 212 U-boats. What are you doing with those boats in the Baltic when you know that the Russians are possibly moving ships?
Well, they're allowed to do that. The Russians can absolutely,
they are allowed. Yeah,
they're in international waters. Go ahead, but submarine, what do submarines do best? Well, they do sneaky submarine stuff, and they observe and report, and you track, and so that's what I would do. I mean, it's not like you can go out and start putting torpedoes into holes. So, but yeah, you make sure that you know what's going on and send the information, and that's probably that would be kind of what I'd be thinking.
So this has been great. I've really enjoyed talking to you. We've been at this, I think, over an hour. Man, like I said, I have so many questions, but hopefully hopefully we can get together down the road and talk again. But I do have one last question for you. And that question is, what is your YouTube guilty pleasure?
Ugh. We talked earlier about YouTube, and I'm not a super big YouTube guy, but I do spend time looking at channels that talk about whiskey. I'm a Scotch drinker. I really enjoy a nice single malt Scotch, and my brother's a bourbon guy, and so he's got me trying a few bourbons, and mostly I can't drink bourbon like I drink Scotch. Scotch, I'm a neat Scotch drinker. Bourbon, I've got to sort of have a cocktail, maybe someday. But yeah, I like looking at YouTube channels that talk about the whiskeys and things like that. And I'm a blues guy, so I really like blues music and blues rock. So I'll watch you know videos or whatever, listen to blues music on YouTube.
That's that's awesome. One of my YouTube guilty pleasures are just watching videos of like food street vendors. Just watching them on the street or in storefronts, just watching the kitchen operations and stuff. I could really lose a lot of time because I'm kind of a foodie, so but it's very different. There's so many detours on YouTube. It's amazing. But thank you for joining us today. Good luck to you in this new year, and I look forward to more writing from you. And I hope, if you're agreeable, if you enjoyed today, I hope that this year we can get together and talk about subs more.
Yep, I did enjoy it, and I'd be happy to come back. And if you look, I've got a couple more articles that are probably going to be coming out this year while I continue working on the book project. So, at some point, good Lord willing, and the river don't rise, we'll get a chance to get that book out there for everybody to see.
And that's it for today, everyone. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the briefing, and we'll come back again. Feel free to contact me via email. I am on Discord, Twitter, and I do have a Patreon. Thanks to USNI for doing the job they do so well. Their publishing arm is an invaluable resource to the preservation of naval history. Consider becoming a member so their work can continue long into the future. Till next time, peace out.